All right, welcome back. So last time we did the bones of the hand and wrist, and we started to get into muscles, but we didn't make it very far. We only got through a couple. But where we left off was here with extensor digitorum. So we started in terms of the musculature with the muscles of the lateral epicondyle, and then eventually we'll work our way back to the medial epicondyle, and then all the muscles that don't fit either category. So one of the things that's in the exam questions and in the quiz questions that you'll see is the concept of extrinsic muscles. You'll see the term extrinsic muscles a few times. So just as an FYI, what extrinsic muscles means in the case of the hand and wrist is an extrinsic muscle is one that originates outside of the hand and inserts inside of the hand. So I guess another way to think about it is it's a muscle that originates proximal to the hand and inserts actually inside of the hand. And there are similar muscles when we talk about the spine. There are intrinsic, extrinsic muscles, and then especially when we talk about the foot and ankle, very similar concept. We'll talk about muscles that originate on the lower leg and insert inside of the foot. Those being extrinsic muscles, are as opposed to intrinsic muscles, which both originate and insert inside of the hand. So for example, on this picture, you can see some intrinsic, so that's an intrinsic thumb muscle there, and then these are some intrinsic finger extensors there. So we're not going to talk about the intrinsics, but just so you know, or you're not thrown off by the wording when you see a question that pertains to extrinsic muscles of the forearm and hand, that's what we're talking about. All right, so back to extensor digitorum. So as with the previous two muscles, it originates from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Remember that the lateral epicondyle is where we've got the wrist extensor and then supinator group. Remember, supination occurs at the radio-ulnar joints. So originates with the lateral epicondyle and inserts into the dorsal expansion of the second through the fifth digits. So in terms of finger numbering, remember that your thumb is number 1. And then the other ones, so starting with the index finger out to the pinky, are 2 through 5 respectively. So anytime you see an extensor or flexor digitorum, that's going to be a muscle that affects the digits that are not the thumb. And it's a very similar concept in the foot, where you have an extensor and a flexor digitorum, and those affect the toes that are not your big toe. So same idea. So the dorsal expansion, what's that? I'll show you a picture of it here in a second, but basically it's that the tendon splits along the interphalangeal joints into 3 different parts, and so it inserts into that dorsal expansion. So you can see there that the belly of extensor digitorum splits into 4 separate tendons. So there's a tendon that goes to your pinky, to your ring finger, to your middle finger, and then to your index finger, and inserts on the distal phalanx of each digit, effectively. Now, into the dorsal expansion, yes, but effectively it has components or branches of the tendon that extend all the way to the distal phalanx of each of those 4 digits. So because it crosses the radiocarpal, which is the wrist joint, the MCP joints, the metacarpophalangeal joints of digits 2 through 5, the PIPs and the DIPs of each of those fingers, then it has actions at each of those. So extensor digitorum is an extensor at the radiocarpal joint, an extensor at the metacarpophalangeal or MCP joint of digits 2 through 5, an extensor at the proximal interphalangeal joints or PIP joints of 2 through 5, and an extensor at the distal interphalangeal joint of digits 2 through 5. All right, so I'm going to do a quick case study, and then I'm going to show you how to find extensor digitorum and then the last 2 that we just did on the anatomy app. So my case study is that we're going to pretend that you are a high school basketball coach and that one of your athletes was getting ready to receive a pass. So she had her hands out in the ready position, ready to catch a chest pass from one of her teammates, but the ball just hit her wrong. So basically what happened is her teammate, rocketed the ball at her, and the ball ended up hitting her on the end of her finger rather than, in the palm or anything. And so when it did that, it forced her finger down into flexion. It forcibly bent her finger. When that happened, she heard and felt a pop. She had immediate pain. She came running over to the sideline, and let's say she was yelling, my finger, my finger. And so she wants you to look at it. When she gets over to the sideline, she's going to have an obvious deformity that I'm going to show you here in a sec, so get ready for that. And the obvious deformity looks like this. So her finger is stuck in hyperextension at the distal interphalangeal joint, and then flexion at the proximal interphalangeal joint. So the question is, what happened? Well, you won't know, so I'll just tell you. So what happened is, as the ball hit the end of her finger, it's going to force those bones up against each other, right? right? So it's going to force the distal phalanx against the middle and the middle phalanx against the proximal phalanx. And so it's usually not enough force to cause the bones to fracture, but instead causes some buckling of the joint capsules and then the collateral ligaments that hold those bones in place. So what you can see here then, so that's your joint capsule on the metacarpophalangeal joint. And then you have a collateral ligament, and then same thing here, collateral ligament there, collateral ligament there. So anytime you've got a hinge joint, as the IP joints are, or as the knee is, or the elbow is, at least the tibiofemoral and humeral ulnar joints respectively are, then you're going to have what are referred to as collateral ligaments. So collateral ligaments run on either side of the joint, and they prevent varus and valgus forces. We talked about that some with the ulnar collateral ligament of the elbow, the UCL, that it limits valgus forces, which again are forces that push from lateral to medial, which are forces that you're going to experience during a throwing motion is the most common sporting example. Your collateral ligaments prevent the bones from buckling side to side, basically. And so what happened in this particular case was as the ball hit the end of her finger, it's going to force the distal phalanx against the middle, and then again middle against the proximal. And so those bones are going to shift around some, and you're probably going to sprain those ligaments. But in addition to that, she actually had an injury to the tendon of extensor digitorum. And so I mentioned a second ago the concept of that dorsal expansion. And so what the dorsal expansion is that, so this is the tendon of extensor digitorum, and you can see it actually splits into three parts. So there's one slip of it over here, and then there's another one over here, so it kind of makes a Y, and then there's a central part of that tendon. And so this central part inserts here on that middle phalanx of the finger. And so what happened when her finger was forced, or was axially loaded, so it was loaded along the long axis. So what happened there is when the ball hit her this way, it hyperextended the DIP joint, but it hyperflexed, or it forcibly flexed, not hyper, but it forcibly flexed the PIP joint. And so when this joint was forced into flexion, she avulsed or pulled off this slip, the central slip of the tendon. And so when that happened, that kind of pulled away some, and then that flexion pushed these two bones, so pushed the distal end of the proximal phalanx and the proximal end of the middle phalanx, actually pushed those two bones through this space between these two slips, right? And so when that happens then, if we back up to her picture, so when that happens then, those two slips, in this case on the lateral aspect, and then the other one you can't see on the medial aspect, those two drop down below the joint line. So that tendon basically runs, the extensor digitorum tendon is basically running straight through here right now. So it's below the joint, so it's actually forcing this PIP joint into flexion, but because of its line of pull, it's actually hyperextending at the DIP joint. So this particular deformity is called a boutonniere deformity. So it looks like a, I think it means buttonhole is actually what it means. But basically it looks like the joint, the PIP joint, actually went through a buttonhole like you would see on a shirt when you push the button through that little slip. Very similar idea in this case, and so that's what she's got going on there. Another similar condition would be mallet finger, and so that's what mallet finger looks like. So rather than an injury to the PIP joint, it's an injury to the DIP joint. Same basic mechanism, except that the DIP is forced into flexion, and so typically what happens here with mallet finger is that distal insertion of the extensor digitorum tendon into the distal phalanx pulls away a little bit, and then to some extent rolls up on itself, not much, but it'll pull away a little bit. Typically, this one is fixed with a brace, and you can buy the braces at CVS and Walgreens and Pick and Save, etc. And basically, all they do is hold your finger straight. And so when they do that, then usually that tendon regrows back enough to have action there at that distal interphalangeal joint. And it'll probably be dropped a little bit. It won't ever be quite straight, but it'll be close enough and functional enough most of the time. All right, so now that we've covered that, let's talk about how to find the muscles we just talked about on our anatomy app. So this is what it looks like when you first open the app. So I'm going to add all 7 layers of muscle to him. There we go. Then I'm going to zoom in on his right side. Remember, everything we're going to do is on the right side. All the pictures you're going to see on the test and quiz are on the right side, so we're going to stick with that theme. and we're going to zoom in on his right side. And also remember that we were looking at the lateral epicondyle muscles. So those are in anatomical position. Those are on the posterior aspect of the forearm. So what we're going to have to do is actually spin them around. All right. So we're going to zoom in a little bit. I'll move down so you can orient yourself some. Okay. So this muscle is one we've already talked about. So this is the brachioradialis muscle, and I'll click on it so the name will pop up. So that's your brachioradialis. We talked about that with the humeral ulnar joint and with the radial ulnar joints because it's flexor, humeral ulnar, and then both a supinator and a pronator, radial ulnar. The two muscles we left off with talking about last time are extensor carpi radialis longus, which is this one, and then extensor carpi radialis brevis. So a longus is obviously a longer muscle. Anything brevis is short. So extensor carpi radialis brevis is shorter than longus. So, and it's shorter in two ways. One is with the origin. So extensor carpi radialis longus originates up a little bit higher on that lateral supracondylar ridge. But then the other thing is that the tendon's a little bit longer when we come down here. So one of my primary suggestions, both on the anatomy app or the pictures from the anatomy app when you get to the quiz and the test, or if we had a traditional lab and we had and we're using the plastic models, one of my primary suggestions is always to follow the tendons in these little forearm and hand muscles and to be really, really familiar with the insertion of the muscles. Not to say you should discount or disregard the origins of them, but definitely make sure you know their insertion because that'll help you figure out which muscle you're looking at. So in the case of extensor carpi radialis longus, it's going to insert on the second metacarpal, the base of the second metacarpal. And so you can see that there. If I spin around a little bit, it becomes even more obvious. So that's your index finger. As opposed to extensor carpi radialis brevis inserts on the base of the third. And so that is there. So be really familiar with where the muscles insert because being able to follow the tendons down to their insertion is going to be pretty crucial to when you see just a picture that looks like this on the quiz without any of the stuff off to the left that tells you what the muscle is. It'll be really helpful to be able to trace where the tendon goes, and that'll help you determine which muscle it is that we're talking about. So make sure you're aware of that. So anyway, those are the two that we talked about last time. The one that we were just talking about is extensor digitorum, and I'm going to rotate him a little bit, see more of the posterior view, or not. There we go. So there's your extensor digitorum. So you can see that, there's the belly, and then the belly splits into 4 tendons, 1 to the 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd. So there is the extensor digitorum muscle. And then, so moving on, talked about all that. All right, so now let's talk about extensor digiti minimi. This is probably my favorite muscle that we're going to talk about. So extensor digiti minimi tells you what it does. So it extends the minimum digit, right? And so the minimum digit is obviously your 5th finger, your pinky. The reason I find it amusing is because I'm old, and the Austin Powers movies from the 90s had a recurring character, Mini-Me, and so extensor digiti minimi always reminds me of that. Anyway, extensor digiti minimi also originates from that lateral epicondyle of the humerus. It's essentially an offshoot of extensor digitorum. And like extensor digitorum, it's going to insert into that dorsal expansion, but only of the 5th digit, so only of the pinky. And like extensor digitorum, it's going to cross the wrist, the radiocarpal joint, the metacarpophalangeal joint, the PIP, and the DIP, but only of the 5th digit. So it's going to be an extensor for all of those. All right, and the last of our lateral epicondyle muscles is our extensor carpi ulnaris. So originates lateral epicondyle, inserts at the base on the medial side of the 5th metacarpal. So remember the metacarpals are the long bones of the hand. One thing I didn't tell you last time is the difference between bases and heads. So the metacarpals have bases and heads, and the bases are the proximal aspects. The heads are the distal aspects of those bones. So what that means then, where it inserts the base, the medial side of the 5th, is that it inserts on the proximal aspect of the 5th metacarpal. In terms of its action, it is an extensor at the radiocarpal joint, and also an ulnar deviator at the radiocarpal joint. All right, so let's find those last two. So all we got to do, rotate him a little more posteriorly. There we go. And so there is his extensor digiti minimi. So that one's pretty straightforward. Again, just try to find the extensor digitorum, comes right off of that. And then your extensor carpi ulnaris is right there. So right off of that. Extensor digitorum and extensor digiti minimi are pretty easy to find on yourself. Again, all these muscles that we just talked about are superficial muscles. So extensor digitorum, the way you find it is to look at the posterior aspect of your forearm and just wiggle your fingers. So digits 2 through 5, and you'll see its belly moving around underneath your skin. And then same kind of thing, if you make a fist and then extend your 5th finger and then just wiggle it, you'll see its little belly contracting. Extensor digitorum is involved in that too, but you can also kind of see more medially where extensor digiti minimi is separate. And then to find extensor carpi ulnaris, it's a little tougher, but basically you find the ridge of your ulna, and then if you make a fist, extend your wrist, and ulnar deviate, it'll kind of pop up underneath your fingers along that ridge of the ulna. So that's those two. And then we're going to go one layer deeper. So extensor indicis is deep to extensor digitorum. So we have to take it off to be able to find extensor indicis. And now we're moving away from those lateral epicondyle muscles. So extensor indicis originates on that posterolateral surface of the ulna and the interosseous membrane. What is that? So interosseous, inter means between, osseous means bones. So an interosseous membrane is a membrane or a layer of fascia that runs between two bones. So we have an interosseous membrane between the radius and the ulna, and then a similar structure in the lower leg where you have an interosseous membrane that runs between the tibia and the fibula. In terms of the insertion of extensor indicis, again, like extensor digitorum and like extensor digiti minimi, inserts into that dorsal expansion, but only affects the second finger or your index finger in this case. So crosses the radiocarpal joint, MCP joint, PIP, and DIP, but all of the second digit. And so it's going to be an extensor at all of those. And so just as an FYI, you probably figured out my system, but where it says MCP2, talking about the second finger. So anytime there's a number after it, that's the particular digit that I'm talking about. That's what that means. And then, all right, so we'll come back to that in a second. So what I want to do is to show you how to find extensor indicis real quick, and then I'll do my little case study thing. All right, so there's extensor digitorum. Again, we got to take that off. So what I'll do is go over here to hide, and it goes away. Move it up a little bit. And so again, follow the tendons. So here's the tendon that's left, all the way back up to here. Boom. There's your extensor indicis. So that's where that muscle is. All right. So now what I want you to do is to make a fist. And so after you make a fist, I want you to have your fingers pointed towards you and the back side of the dorsal aspect of your hand pointed away. So keep that nice tight fist. And I want you to extend your ring finger as far as you can while maintaining a nice tight fist. And if you're still keeping your fist closed, you've probably only made about a 90-degree angle there between your 4th finger and your hand. So you can't get your 4th finger up very high. All right, again, so bring that one back down, nice tight fist. Now flip me off or flip off your screen, right? So in order to do that and really get your 3rd finger back into a neutral position, you kind of have to loosen your fist a little bit. You kind of have to open it up some. All right, so there's that. All right, so then go back. So we got our fist again. So now I want you to maintain your nice tight fist. Extend your 5th finger up as high as you can. Okay, so you should be able to get back to basically a neutral position without having to open up your hand at all or open up your fingers much, if at all. And then do the same thing with your pinky up at your 2nd finger. Right, and so same kind of thing, you should be able to extend your 2nd finger pretty easily, so your index finger, pretty easily without breaking your nice tight fist. And so now flip it around to where the back side of your hand is facing you. Woo, hook 'em horns. All right, so the question is, why is it relatively easy to independently extend the 2nd and the 5th fingers, but certainly not the 4th, and to some extent not the 3rd? And the answer to the question is, of course, that both the 2nd finger and the 5th finger have their own independent extensor muscles. So extensor indicis, whenever you pick up your index finger alone, is the one doing that, is the primary agonist there. And then extensor digiti minimi is the one extending your 5th finger independently. So because they have their own 2 little independent extensor muscles, then you can raise them or extend them by themselves. So my point there is it almost just seems natural to do the hook 'em horns, right? be a Longhorn fan and to be enthusiastic about them. All right, enough pandering. Okay, so moving on. So now we're on the medial epicondyle. So remember, the medial epicondyle is the site of origin of the wrist flexor pronator group. So the next three muscles are all, or four muscles, are all going to originate there. So the first one here is our flexor carpi radialis. So it originates at the medial epicondyle, inserts into the base of the second and third metacarpals, but this time on the palmar aspect. In terms of action, so it's going to be a flexor radiocarpal joint, and then because its line of pull is slightly off center from the radiocarpal joint, it's also going to be a radial deviator. So the way that ulnar and radial deviation works, particularly ulnar deviation, is you have one extensor and one flexor that are sort of off center. And so when those two muscles contract, then you're going to get ulnar deviation. So in that case, you're going to have flexor carpi ulnaris, which we'll get to here in a second, and then extensor carpi ulnaris. Radial deviation is a little more complex in that we have a few more muscles. So there's extensor carpi radialis longus. According to this app, there's extensor carpi radialis brevis, because one of the other books I use doesn't include that one. But nonetheless, extensor carpi radialis longus brevis, flexor carpi radialis, and then as you'll see, some of the thumb muscles are also involved in radial deviation as well. All right, so that's flexor carpi radialis. Then we're going to move on to palmaris longus. I have to apologize. My picture here is still a flexor carpi radialis, but palmaris longus is here. So the muscle that should be highlighted is this one that I'm mousing over the belly. That's your palmaris longus. So again, also originates from the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The insertion is the palmar aponeurosis. What is that? So an aponeurosis is a flat sheet of connective tissue. And so obviously it's on the palm. And so the palmaris longus muscle inserts into this flat sheet of connective tissue here. That's your palmar aponeurosis. So palmaris longus is a flexor at the radiocarpal joint. And then because of its origin up here on the medial epicondyle, it's also a weak flexor at the humeral-ulnar joint. So this is the one I mentioned when we talked about Tommy John surgery, which is repair of the ulnar collateral ligament of the elbow, or the humeral-ulnar joint. And so this is the one where if you injured your right UCL, they might, in terms of the repair, harvest your left palmaris longus tendon. So get my mouse up, down in here by the wrist. They might harvest part of this tendon to serve as the repair tissue for your ulnar collateral ligament. Palmaris longus is pretty easy to find in most of us. Not everybody has it. I think like 4 out of 5 people have it, and maybe a little bit more than that. But to find it, all you have to do is extend your fingers. So straighten your fingers as hard as you can, and then flex your wrist a little bit, and it should pop off basically right along the center or right along the midline of your wrist. You'll have one little isolated tendon that pops right up. That's your palmaris longus. And then the last of our superficial medial epicondyle muscles is our flexor carpi ulnaris. Again, originates from the medial epicondyle. The insertion, you can see the pisiform, the hook of the hamate, and the base of the fifth metacarpal. Remember that when we talked about the pisiform, I mentioned that it was a sesamoid bone, which means it's a bone inside of a tendon, and it's inside the tendon of the flexor carpi ulnaris. So that's the one point of insertion of this muscle. So it's also a wrist flexor, because again, wrist flexor group. And then because it's off center in terms of its line of pull, it is also an ulnar deviator. So wrist flexor and ulnar deviator for flexor carpi ulnaris. All right, so let's find those before we flip to talking about the deeper finger flexors. So I'm going to zoom out and I'm going to spin them around because we're talking about the medial epicondyle muscles, which are on the anterior aspect in anatomical position. Zoom back in. Okay, so I'm going to take off or hide the bicipital aponeurosis. And then, so our medial epicondyle group includes pronator teres, so that's this muscle here. And then we've got our flexor carpi radialis. Flexor carpi radialis is there. And then, so moving lateral to medial, still moving more medially. Now we got our palmaris longus, which is there. And then the most medial of them is the flexor carpi ulnaris, which is right there. So those are the superficial medial epicondyle muscles. So in order to find those, because it is pretty straightforward finding basically where they are, what you would do is, so I always use my right arm. So take your right arm or look at your right arm, roll your sleeve up if you're wearing long sleeves, And then find your medial epicondyle, which again is a pretty obvious knob there on the inside of your right elbow. So what I want you to do is take your left hand and use your thumb, index finger, middle finger, and ring finger, and place that kind of fat area near your thumb. It's called the thenar eminence. You have some intrinsic muscles there. Place that area proximal to your thumb, that fat area, that thenar eminence. Put that right there on your medial epicondyle, and then lay those 4 fingers over your right forearm. So left hand over the right forearm. Where your thumb sits now is approximately where pronator teres sits. And then where your index finger is about where the belly is of flexor carpi radialis. Your middle finger should line up pretty closely with the palmaris longus. And if you extend your fingers on the right side and flex your wrist a little bit, you should see that tendon pop right up. Usually your middle finger lines right up with it. And then where your ring finger is where flexor carpi ulnaris is. So it's kind of an easy way to remember where each of those are. All right, so quick case study, and then we'll move on to the deeper layers. In my case study, we're going to pretend that you are a youth baseball coach. And the team that you're coaching is a U14 team, so under 14. And your star pitcher is a 13-year-old male. He comes to you complaining of medial elbow pain. He says he hurt his elbow at this bump, pointing to his medial epicondyle, on the inside of his elbow, and it's been painful for more than a month. So this has been going on for a while. You've noticed he hasn't been able to throw as hard lately. And his pitching, he has been pitching pretty frequently, as your team has been attending tournaments for a few weeks in a row, and he often pitches in more than one game during each tournament. The pain is worst at the start of the acceleration phase. So when he goes from full external rotation of the shoulder, now he starts to move into powerful internal rotation. That's when he gets a sharp pain on the inside of his elbow or at the medial epicondyle. And then it aches long after he's done pitching. You notice that his medial epicondyle appears swollen relative to his non-throwing arm, and that his throwing arm appears to be stuck in flexion at the elbow. So my question for you is, what could be going on? Why does this kid have pain on the inside of his elbow when he throws? Well, given his history, so he's been pitching a lot with relatively little rest, and the pain has been going on for a long time, so more than a month, and it's been getting consistently worse. Your immediate thought would be Little League elbow. And obviously he's a Little League player. So he probably has, in this case he does, have Little League elbow. What is that? Well, Little League elbow is a traction apophysitis or anapophysitis at the medial epicondyle. What do those things mean? Well, I'm showing you an x-ray real quick. Maybe. There we go. All right. So injury on the left, and then with rest on the right. So what you're looking at here, so obviously you're looking at an x-ray of the elbow. So this is the humerus, and you're looking at the posterior aspect of it. So this is the humerus. This is your radius. This is your ulna. So medial aspect over here, lateral aspect over here. So you'll notice that he has these dark black lines right here. So there's one there at the distal aspect of the humerus. There's one here on the proximal aspect of the radius, and then there's also one on the olecranon that's not super obvious. And then there's another dark line right here. So what these lines are, so on the distal humerus and on the proximal radius, those are growth plates. The more technical term for them is epiphyseal plates. And we'll talk about them more when we get to bones. But the way that long bones grow in length is that you have these cartilaginous plates at either end, the proximal end and the distal end, and you lay down new bone at those plates, and so then that makes the bone longer, and that eventually those plates fuse. That's when you become skeletally mature, so the whole thing becomes calcified, becomes solid bone. But before that time, those plates are essentially weak spots in the bone. So oftentimes kids can get fractures there, whereas they wouldn't get, let's say a mid-shaft humeral fracture, but they may get a fracture down here at the growth plate if they, in this case, fall on an outstretched arm or something like that. Similarly, some muscles and ligaments have growth plates underneath them, and so that's called an apophysis. And so if there is a cartilaginous plate underneath a site of muscle origin or insertion, again, that's kind of a weak spot in the bone. So if those muscles are overactive, if you will, or they're contracting too strongly or too frequently without rest between those really strong contractions, then you can cause some damage there at that cartilaginous plate. And so that is primarily what little league elbow is an inflammation, because it's an apophysitis, and itis is an inflammation. It's an inflammation at this apophysis, at this cartilaginous plate. And so remember, on the inside or on the medial aspect of the elbow, not only is your UCL active to stabilize the medial aspect of the elbow, but the dynamic stabilizers, the muscular stabilizers, include all of those wrist flexor muscles that we just talked about. The primary stabilizers are actually your pronator teres muscle, your flexor carpi ulnaris, and then a muscle we haven't talked about yet, which is flexor digitorum superficialis. So with this pitcher, he's been throwing really hard with relatively little rest between. And so basically those strong repetitive contractions of the forearm flexor pronator muscles have started to pull away from the rest of the humerus. So their site, or their origin here at the medial epicondyle, it started to pull away, put some traction, which is tension pulling apart on this growth plate here, and so it's widened this growth plate. And so then after we let this kid rest for a while, you'll see the growth plate narrows some, so it kind of grows back together a little bit. If this kid fights through it, which does happen sometimes, he gets what's referred to as an avulsion injury, which is actually where this little thing will pop off. So you can actually widen the plate so much that eventually you pull away part of that, in this case, distal aspect of the medial epicondyle. So part of this bone could actually pop off here. So we don't want them to do that, because then they may have to get surgery. So we prefer to avoid that. And so if we just treat it with a rest, oftentimes it's self-limiting. It grows back together. So that's the primary thing that occurs with little league elbow, is this traction apophysitis. But there are other things that happen as well that are kind of grouped under that general name of little league elbow. So one of the things that happens is related to the radius and the capitulum. So remember that the radial head, which is over here, so there's your radial head, and then the capitulum, which kind of looks like that golf ball on that lateral distal aspect of the humerus, those two articulate together. And so you can see there's a pretty wide joint space there between those two. So during a throwing motion, you get traction or pulling apart at the inside of the elbow or on the medial aspect of the elbow. Well, if I've got traction on the inside or medial aspect, I've got compression on the lateral aspect. And so every time you throw, then the radial head bumps up against the capitulum, closes that joint space. And so that repetitive bumping can actually compress the cartilage that lines the end of, or that lines the capitulum, and then can compress the underlying bone and can actually kill some of that underlying bone. And so effectively what ends up happening then is that dead, if you will, bone and cartilage actually breaks off and starts to float around inside of the joint, which is called an osteochondritis dissecans, OCD for short, or more colloquially, it's called a joint mouse, because on x-rays, you'll see a little floating thing in the joint, and then different x-rays, it moves around, and so it'll be in different spots, so it's called a joint mouse. So you can get a fracture of the capitulum or the radial head. The capitulum is more common. The other thing that you can get, or a couple other things you can get with this, are bone spurs or osteophytes that build up on the olecranon from bumping up against the humerus. And you can also get, and it's not pictured here, but you can also get a stress fracture at the growth plate on the olecranon as well. So that would also be grouped under little league elbow. All right, so enough with the medical stuff. Let's talk about the rest of the finger flexors. Sorry, I had to take a little pause there. You might have heard some snoring in the background. I'm recording this at the house, and so that was my lab's adrenus, who is laying under me and snoring pretty hard. So apologize if you heard that. I had to poke at him to get him to move. So hopefully that background noise will go away. All right, so continuing with the finger flexor muscles, we're moving on. So we're actually gonna go a layer deeper now. So we got to take off all those superficial muscles from the medial epicondyle we just talked about. And so here's one of the stabilizers of the medial elbow that I mentioned. So this is flexor digitorum superficialis. Remember, there's something superficial, it's closer to the skin surface. So you can see the origin there at the medial epicondyle of the humerus, but in addition to that, it also originates on the radius as well. So it effectively has two heads. Those two come together, and then the tendon splits into four, just like when we talked about extensor digitorum. And then it's going to insert on the middle phalanges, I almost said phalanxes, and middle phalanges of digits 2 through 5. And that insertion site is going to be important, because since it inserts on the middle phalanx, so here, 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 and here, rather than the distal phalanx, it can't cause any action. It can't move the DIP, the distal interphalangeal joints, because it inserts here, right? So in terms of the actions here, flexor digitorum superficialis is a flexor, radiocarpal. It's also, because it originates on the humerus, at least part of it does, it's a weak flexor at the elbow, weak flexor humeral ulnar joint, and then it's a flexor at the MCP, so metacarpophalangeal, and PIP, proximal interphalangeal joints of digits 2 through 5, which makes it a little bit different from its colleague, I guess is a word for that, which is flexor digitorum profundus. So now we're going another layer deeper. So in order to see superficialis, we had to actually take off pronator. Well, we didn't have to take off pronator teres, but we did. But we had to take off flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. Then we got to flexor digitorum superficialis. Now we took it off, and now we can see flexor digitorum profundus. So profundus, a few differences between it and superficialis. One, it doesn't originate above the elbow, and in fact, it originates along the ulna. So you can see the posterior and medial borders of the ulna and the interosseous membrane. And then it's going to insert on the distal phalanges of digits 3 through 5. So flexor digitorum profundus then is going to cause flexion at the radiocarpal joint, flexion at the MCP joints, PIP joints, and the DIP joints. So that's one of the questions in the quiz bank, or there's actually, I think, a couple questions in the quiz bank about differences between flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus. What I want you to know is that profundus inserts on the distal phalanx, superficialis inserts on the middle phalanx, and then, as you'll see here in a second, that has injury implications. So know the difference in insertion between those two and how that then affects their actions. Profundus causes actions at the DIP, superficialis can't. All right, so my case study, or your case study here, we have a football linebacker, a defensive player, who is trying to make a tackle of an offensive player. And so what he did, our defensive player, reached out, was able to get a hold of the jersey of the offensive player, but he wasn't able to stop him, wasn't able to pull him down. So the offensive player kept going. Our defensive guy is making a nice tight fist, but his fist gets ripped open, basically. He's flexing his fingers as hard as he can, but his fingers get pulled into extension. When that happens, he feels a pop in his ring finger, so his fourth finger on that side, and then feels immediate pain. He comes over to the sideline and he tells you about what just happened. And so one of the things you're going to ask him to do is to make a fist. And he says, all right, here's what it looks like. So he has to make a fist. You'll notice on his ring finger that he can't flex at the DIP joint. Well, what has happened there? What happened is that he pulled away that distal insertion of the flexor digitorum profundus tendon, where it inserts there on the distal phalanx of the fourth digit. So effectively, from making a really tight fist, from really grabbing onto that jersey, and then his fist being pulled, his fingers being pulled into extension, that overloaded that flexor tendon and caused it to pull away some from that distal phalanx. And so because it has pulled away and rolled up on itself a little bit, now he can't flex at the DIP joint of his fourth finger. And if that goes on for a while, so if he came in a few hours after the game or something, you would see the bruising there and the swelling. And then the other thing you'll notice is there's a little bit of a bulge here. So that tendon tends to roll up on itself a little bit. So you can use a brace for this one. Looks pretty similar to the other brace. But this one is not self-limiting to the same extent that an extensor tendon injury is. So this one, which is called jersey finger, may require surgical intervention. So the reason it's called jersey finger, I don't know if many of you probably aren't familiar with older football jerseys, but especially in the 70s and 80s, the jerseys had really big holes in them to maximize airflow, try to keep the players cool. But if you've got the relatively big holes, and then sometimes those jerseys would tear, then you've got a fairly big hole that a finger could easily get stuck in. And so defensive players would get their finger stuck in that hole and then get their hand ripped open or forced open. And so then you'd get that flexor tendon avulsion. And so that's where the name jersey finger comes from, is from getting your hand stuck in their jersey. So that's an avulsion of the flexor digitorum profundus tendon. All right, so now you've seen all that. Let's find those two. So as mentioned, these are deeper muscles. So we're going to start here at the pronator teres. We're going to hide it. While I'm at it, I'm going to hide brachioradialis, just to make life easier. We'll hide our flexor carpi radialis. We'll hide our palmaris longus, and we'll hide our flexor carpi ulnaris. All right, so what we're left with then is our flexor digitorum superficialis. So, and you can follow its insertion down a little bit, and you can see if I zoom in some. So you can see how it inserts there at the middle phalanx of each of those digits. Okay, and so the other thing is you can kind of see the arrangement. It has a similar slip arrangement to what we talked about with the extensor tendon. So you get this sort of Y arrangement here, and then this tendon that keeps going is the flexor digitorum profundus tendon there. All right, so let's zoom back out. So that's flexor digitorum superficialis, and then we're going to hide it. And then there is our flexor digitorum profundus right there. So there's those two. And we're getting toward the home stretch now. Did all that. All right, so let's talk about thumb muscles. So we have 4 muscles left. So with the thumb muscles, a thing to know is that anytime we're talking about pollicis or pollex, that is referring to the thumb. So extensor pollicis then is a muscle that extends the thumb. And again, if it's longest, it's longer than some other muscle. So pollicis is longest. So anytime you see pollicis, just know we're talking about thumb. Digitorum, we're talking about all the digits, the fingers in this case, that aren't the thumb. So in terms of its origin, so the posterolateral surface of the ulna and the interosseous membrane, which we've already talked about, inserts on the base of the distal phalanx of the first digit. So for these next 3 muscles, what we're effectively doing is working from a distal insertion to a proximal insertion. So extensor pollicis longus, you see the belly up here, and inserts all the way down here on the distal phalanx. And so because it inserts on the distal phalanx, it crosses the radiocarpal joint, crosses the carpometacarpal here, crosses the metacarpophalangeal, and then crosses the IP joint. So it has actions at each. So then at the wrist, it's an extensor, it's a radial deviator, and then the carpometacarpal joint, which remember is between the trapezium and then the proximal aspect of the first metacarpal, so that's your carpometacarpal joint. It's an adductor there. And then again, so 1 means first finger. And then it's an extensor, metacarpophalangeal, extensor, interphalangeal. So the next one is extensor pollicis brevis. And so brevis is shorter, it's brevis for a couple of reasons. 1 is the origin, but 2 is the insertion. So whereas longus inserts on the distal phalanx, brevis inserts on the proximal phalanx. So you can see the origin of extensor pollicis brevis, the posterior surface of the distal radius, again, kind of a nebulous origin, the interosseous membrane, and then the insertion again is the base of the proximal phalanx of the first digit. So in terms of its actions, it's a radial deviator at the radiocarpal joint or the wrist, and then an extensor, carpometacarpal, and then an extensor, metacarpophalangeal, but it can't act at the IP joint because it doesn't cross that one. So because it inserts on the proximal phalanx, can't have any action at the IP joint of the thumb. So remember when we talked about the scaphoid, we talked about the anatomical snuff box. And so the anatomical snuff box, the way to find it, or to make it really obvious, is so if you extend your wrist a little bit, extend your thumb as hard as you can, and then radial deviate. And you'll see 2 tendons pop off proximal to your thumb. And so those 2 tendons are the muscles that we just talked about. So if we back up a little bit, the extensor pollicis longus tendon is the one on the dorsal aspect of the hand, so it's closer to the back of your hand, and then the extensor pollicis brevis is the one that's closer to the palmar aspect of your hand. So those are the 2 tendons that form the anatomical snuff box, extensor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. And again, between those 2 tendons, that's where you've got the scaphoid. Somebody really stretches their wrist into hyperextension, and then they have pain there in the snuff box between those 2 tendons. We would suspect potentially they have a scaphoid fracture. So those are the 2 long thumb extensor tendons. And then running right next to brevis is our abductor pollicis longus. So you can see the origin there, the middle third of the posterior surface of the radius and the ulna. Abductor pollicis longus is a surprisingly big muscle. And then also the interosseous membrane. And then so it's going to insert on the base of the first metacarpal. So again, we're moving proximally. So now we're onto the metacarpal rather than the proximal phalanx or the distal phalanx. Inserting there on the metacarpal. So it really only crosses 2 joints. It crosses the radiocarpal or the wrist joint, where it's a radial deviator, and then the carpometacarpal joint where it's an abductor, which its name tells you that. So it's an abductor at the carpometacarpal joint. So this is one, I mean, the longus and brevis tendons are pretty obvious because of the anatomical snuff box, but actually, if you're bored, if you go off of the brevis tendon, you can kind of dig your fingernail in there a little bit, and you can find the abductor tendon because it actually runs right next to it. So it's one that's fairly easy to find if you know how to look for it. And then last, but certainly not least, the flexor pollicis longus muscle. So you can see the origin there, the interosseous membrane and anterior surface of the radius. It runs all the way down to the distal phalanx. And so like extensor pollicis longus, it's going to cross the radiocarpal joint, the carpometacarpal joint, the MCP, and the IP joint of the thumb. It's going to have actions at each. Radial deviator at the wrist, a flexor at the carpometacarpal joint, a flexor at the metacarpophalangeal joint, and then a flexor at the IP joint. As an aside, I'm pretty sure I took these actions from the app, but I believe our textbook has flexor pollicis longus as a radiocarpal flexor, which I've seen fairly commonly. So if you group this one in as a wrist flexor, I think that would be correct as well. All right, so let's find those little thumb muscles on the anatomy app, and then we'll call it a day. So we're going to spin them around, maybe. There we go. So we're going to spin them around, and then I'm going to kind of look at more of a 3/4 view. All right, so remember our anatomical snuff box. So we've got the tendon that makes up the posterior aspect of it right here. And so that's our extensor pollicis longus. And again, if you don't know which muscle it is, make sure you follow the tendon. And if you're familiar, or if you know that pollicis longus runs all the way to the distal phalanx, then you'll know that this is pollicis longus here, because its tendon goes down to the distal phalanx. Then we've got our extensor pollicis brevis right here. And so you can see it's that more palmar aspect of the anatomical snuff box. And then if we, I mean, you can see it right there, but there's your abductor. But I was trying to get to a view of the tendon. So the abductor, pretty big belly. And then if we keep rotating him, you can see how it runs right next to the extensor pollicis brevis tendon. And so just one thing to keep in mind, we've taken off extensor digitorum. So it would normally be in here. So in order to find these, or to make it easier to find them, we take off extensor digitorum. And then flip around to the front side, maybe. Okay. And remember on the front side, I've already removed all the superficial layer of wrist flexors and pronators. I've removed flexor digitorum superficialis. And so now I see flexor digitorum profundus, but then also the long thumb flexor there, flexor pollicis longus. So that's where it sits. And if you want to make its tendon more obvious, you can take off these little intrinsic muscles of the thumb, hide those guys, maybe. And so that's where I mentioned the thenar eminence. There's obvious, it's the fatter part of your hand. It's not actual fat, like not adipocytes or not adipose tissue, but there's some musculature there. So that's there. Okay, now let's go back to make it more obvious. There we go. So now that we remove those two intrinsic muscles, the tendon's even more obvious. All right, so that's it. Those are your hand and wrist extrinsic muscles. And so next time we'll pick up with joints. So we'll see you then.